Hannibal, a name that echoed through history as both a symbol of triumph and a symbol of defeat. His journey was not merely one of battle and strategy, but of the psyche, a labyrinth of emotions as convoluted as the mountains he crossed, the rivers he conquered, and the cities he razed. In the wake of his audacious crossing of the Alps, he did not just fight Rome, he fought against the internal weight of his own burdens, his past, and his drive for revenge. He was still a boy when his father, Hamilcar, took him to the altar of vengeance. Swearing an oath of eternal hatred for Rome, young Hannibal was molded into a force of nature, a being whose ambition could only be equaled by the depth of his loss. His father, the guiding figure of his youth, had fallen in battle, leaving the weight of an ancient grudge upon Hannibal's shoulders. But it was more than a mission. It was a personal vendetta, an aching void left by a world that had already taken too much from him. As Hannibal marched his army across the rugged terrain of Italy, the first crack of doubt began to emerge. They had conquered the seemingly impossible feat of the Alps, but now the journey would test him not only as a commander, but as a man. The war with Rome had become less about tactics and more about survival. Every setback felt personal, every failure a mark on his very soul. He could not afford to show weakness. His soldiers, the very men he had led through hell, looked to him not just for guidance, but for hope. His image as a leader was forged in the crucible of impossible circumstances. The first major loss came at the Battle of the Ticinus River. Despite his victory, there was a gnawing sense of failure. He had come so far, and yet Rome's resolve was unbroken. A psychological battle began within him. What was the cost of this endless war? Hannibal's mind, sharp and calculating, could not escape the whispers of doubt. The toll of leadership began to weigh heavier than the death toll of battle. His nights were sleepless, filled with visions of Rome's Senate, his enemies plotting behind their marble walls. But the vision that haunted him the most was that of his brother Hasdrubal, whose safety he could not ensure. Their shared dream was crumbling like sand through his fingers. He had placed his hopes in these soldiers, in these alliances, but with every defeat, it was harder to tell if victory was within reach, or if he was walking a path towards certain destruction. The Battle of Cannae, however, brought a fleeting taste of triumph, a feeling of invincibility that lasted only as long as it took for Rome to rebuild its forces. They were resilient, unyielding, and so the psychological war turned inward. His most devastating defeat wasn't in battle. It was the knowledge that no matter how many victories he claimed, Rome could always recover. His dream was always on the edge of slipping away, like a beautiful yet fleeting vision. Was this cycle of endless conquest really the revenge he sought? The endless battle with Rome's republic weighed on Hannibal's heart, though he would never speak of it. Who was he truly fighting for, he wondered. Was it for his father's memory, for Carthage? Or was it for something darker, more personal, a battle against himself? A struggle against the void that grew deeper with every lost opportunity, with every failure that marred his name? Then came the final blow, his failure to secure the reinforcement from his brother Hasdrubal. The reinforcements never came, leaving Hannibal isolated in the heart of enemy territory. There were no more mountains to climb, no more rivers to cross, only the emptiness of defeat, the silence of a war that could not be won. And yet, in the shadow of failure, Hannibal did not crumble. He could not afford to. It was not victory that kept him going. It was the refusal to let Rome's republic erase the honor of his name. He had to fight, not because he believed in winning anymore, but because to stop would have meant surrendering to something worse than death. With each day that passed, Hannibal's resilience became a quiet war of its own. His heart, battered by the weight of his losses, beat against the encroaching tide of despair. He carried within him the weight of his soldiers' faith, his people's hope, and the ghosts of his fallen brothers. Every failure became fuel for the fight, not for glory, but for survival, for the preservation of his spirit. The failure was not just on the battlefield. It was on the roads he had walked, in the paths that had once been filled with promise, but were now marked with sorrow. Yet Hannibal's journey was not one of despair. He fought on because it was his nature to fight, even when the war seemed lost. His mind wrestled with the eternal question: what is the worth of a man who has lost everything but refuses to fall? He would not let Rome's victory define his soul, and so the walk continued, one step at a time, through a landscape that no longer seemed filled with possibilities, but with the stark clarity of inevitable defeat. The winds of time, fickle and indifferent, had eroded the mighty reputation Hannibal had once held. The legions of Rome, ever rejuvenated, had found a way to stand against him, to recover even from the most crushing of defeats. And as he moved deeper into the heart of Italy, carrying the weight of an army increasingly thin, weary, and demoralized, he could feel the distance between himself and his dreams widening. There was a certain inevitability to failure. It was no longer a matter of if, but when. His mind had turned inward, torn between the responsibility he held to his men, the weight of his past, and the bitterness that his greatest triumphs were only a prelude to a much darker reality. Hannibal's struggle with the ghosts of lost battles, both on the field and within himself, became a constant companion. He had once been the embodiment of the Carthaginian dream, an unstoppable force leading an army through one of the most extraordinary campaigns in history. But now, as he stood at the edge of the Apennines, his army weakened and his allies distant, the war felt increasingly like a futile attempt to hold on to something slipping through his fingers. There was no glory left to be won here, only the sense of an endless spiral downward. His heart, heavy with regret, was pulling him toward an inescapable conclusion. His war was over. The final act in this relentless tragedy was played out in the shadow of the great Roman consul, Scipio Africanus, whose rising star seemed to cast a shadow long enough to engulf Hannibal's dreams. Rome had learned from its mistakes, adapted and built itself into something resilient, something unstoppable. At the Battle of Zama, the dust of history settled on the field, and Hannibal was confronted by the full weight of his failure. It was not just the defeat itself, but the crushing realization that the war was lost, that his vision had been vanquished by time, by Rome's unyielding persistence. It was in the moments before the clash of armies at Zama that Hannibal's mind wandered, away from strategy and tactics, away from the drumbeat of war, and into a more personal realm. How did he end up here? What had brought him from the ambitious young commander, crossing the Alps in defiance of all reason, to this grim, shadowed figure, desperately trying to preserve a life that had long since begun to crumble? There was a moment, fleeting and nearly imperceptible, when he thought about surrendering. Not in the sense of laying down arms on the battlefield. Hannibal would never do that. No, it was the surrender of something deeper, something much harder to confront, his own identity. His whole life had been defined by a war that now seemed endless and fruitless. His vision had been unrelenting, but now it had lost its meaning. His identity as a conqueror, a general, was collapsing under the pressure of Rome's victory and his own growing despair. The battle at Zama itself was brutal, but Hannibal's struggle was even more profound. His strategies failed, his foresight lacked the sharpness it once had. His soldiers no longer followed with the fervor they once had when they believed in the cause. He was no longer the unstoppable force. He was simply a man caught in the tide of his own failures. As the battle reached its fateful conclusion, with Scipio's forces overwhelming his own, Hannibal was forced to make a choice. To stand and face his final defeat, or to retreat, not just physically from the field, but from the very idea of victory itself. The decision to retreat was not one of cowardice, but of survival, a desperate last-ditch effort to preserve something of his soul. But the truth remained. He had lost. In the months following the defeat at Zama, Hannibal's life descended into a quiet, lingering end. His role in Carthage, once paramount, dwindled to that of a mere advisor, his voice no longer holding the weight it once did. He had seen the rise and fall of empires, the ebb and flow of power, and now he was nothing more than a shadow of a past that could no longer be relived. But in his isolation, in the years of exile that followed, Hannibal did not disappear into despair. Instead, he became a man forever defined by his losses, a figure of deep introspection, more interested in the reflection of his own soul than in the reflection of the world around him. The failure he faced was not just of a general, but of a man who had placed his entire identity in a war that had never truly belonged to him. Even as his days grew numbered, Hannibal did not succumb to bitterness. He had lived through defeat, watched everything he had built crumble, and yet he still stood. In the quiet hours of his exile, he would reflect on the choices he had made and the paths he had taken. There was no redemption to be found, no final victory to claim. His soul was weary, worn down by the years of struggle. Yet, within that weariness, there was something else. An understanding that despite everything, despite every failure, he had never truly stopped fighting. His final moments, spent far from the battlefields he had once ruled, were peaceful in their solitude. The fire of his ambition had dimmed, the weight of his regret no longer a burden he could carry. Hannibal, the great general, the man who had once stood at the helm of an empire's last hope, passed into history. But what remained was the shadow of a man who had faced not only the world's greatest empire, but also the deepest recesses of his own heart. And as history looked back on him, it would not just be as a general who had lost to Rome, but as a man who, even in his defeat, never stopped walking.